The drill broke through at 4:47 in the morning. It wasn't the flood tunnels. It wasn't another wooden platform. It wasn't the same stubborn wall of collapsed debris that had stopped serious attempts for more than 2 centuries. It was something else entirely. When the core sample came up from 120 feet, the geologist on site turned it over in her hands 3 times before speaking. In the dim light before dawn, she set it carefully on the table, looked across at Rick Lagina, and said 6 words no one in 23 years of Oak Island work had ever said. This did not form here naturally. Rick had been awake for 19 hours, watching the drill push deeper through the night, past the depths previous teams had reached and past the ones they hadn't, past the flood tunnel zone, past the transition into bedrock, into ground that had been theorized about for decades but never physically penetrated. He picked up the core. It was dense, compressed, structured in a way the surrounding geology simply could not explain. It didn't match the natural layers around it. He didn't celebrate. He didn't make a phone call. He just stood there in the darkness, holding proof that something had been deliberately placed beneath Oak Island at a depth skeptics had long claimed was unreachable. It wasn't treasure. Not yet. It was something more important. It was the end of a question. A question that had followed Rick Lagina since he was a boy in Michigan, reading about Oak Island in a magazine. A question that had shaped more than 2 decades of his adult life. A question the world had debated since 1795. Is there really something down there? At 120 feet, pulled from the earth before sunrise, the answer was finally physical, tangible, undeniable. Yes, 23 years is a long time to stay committed to a mystery. Most people develop an obsession and eventually move on. The excitement fades, the resistance builds. The lack of clear results makes it harder to justify the time, money, and energy. But a commitment that lasts decades, real decades, not the romantic idea of them, is different. It means years of uncertainty, years without proportional reward, years without definitive answers. Rick Lagina has lived in that space since childhood, but his connection to Oak Island after 23 years wasn't the same as when he first read about it. It wasn't wide-eyed fascination anymore. It had evolved. It became precise, analytical, grounded. He had handled every artifact recovered, studied every survey, lived through every failed excavation. He understood the island in a way that only physical presence and time can create. He knew exactly where every previous effort had stopped. He knew why it had stopped. He knew why each stopping point had felt like a ceiling. For modern investigations, that ceiling was usually around 90 feet. That's where the flood tunnel system would activate with overwhelming force, collapsing walls, flooding shafts, turning controlled digs into water disasters. Teams with serious equipment, serious funding, and serious engineering had all hit the same barrier. Skeptics pointed to that depth as proof. If a vault existed, it was effectively unreachable. But Rick had come to believe something different. He didn't think the solution was bigger pumps or stronger walls. Every attempt to overpower the flood system had failed. The more aggressively teams pumped, the more the island's natural hydraulics seemed to respond. The system scaled. It adapted. Fighting it head-on was the mistake. Over years of conversations with drilling engineers, geologists, and technical experts, Rick began thinking differently. The goal wasn't to excavate through the flood zone, it was to penetrate below it. That distinction changed everything. Excavating through the flood zone means triggering the very system designed to stop you. Removing large volumes of soil changes pressure conditions underground. That pressure change activates the tunnels, drawing ocean water inward. But drilling, a controlled, narrow penetration, doesn't create the same pressure differential. It can reach depths without activating the defensive response above. Instead of battling the system, you bypass it. And 120 feet was not just another number. It wasn't simply deeper than 80, 90, or 100 feet. It represented something the cumulative geological data, layer by layer, year after year, had increasingly suggested, that everything above was defensive, The flood system, the layered platforms, the engineered obstacles, defense, and 120 feet was behind it. Rick had believed that for 3 years before he had the operational capability to test it. The challenge wasn't just theory, it was logistics, funding, precision drilling technology, and timing. When the drill finally reached that depth without triggering chaos, and the core came up with material that did not belong to natural formation, it shifted the entire conversation. The discovery wasn't treasure. It was confirmation. It meant that the island's deepest mystery wasn't just legend, misinterpretation, or hopeful storytelling layered over natural geology. Something had been placed there, deliberately. And for Rick Lagina, standing in the dark at 4:47 in the morning, that realization was bigger than gold. It meant the question that had defined most of his life no longer lived in the realm of belief. It lived in his hands. A precision drill moving straight down through the flood zone creates a completely different underground pressure effect than a large excavation. An excavation removes massive amounts of soil. That change in pressure is what activates the flood tunnel system. But a narrow drill string, operating at a controlled rate and small diameter, doesn't disturb the surrounding ground in the same way. It reads the geology instead of disrupting it. The flood system reacts to excavation. It does not react to a drill string the same way. Rick's entire strategy was built around that difference. It took 3 full seasons to develop a drilling protocol capable of reliably reaching 120 feet without triggering flood activation. 3 seasons of testing, adjusting, refining equipment, and modifying procedures. From the outside, it looked like more of the same Oak Island effort. Slow progress, incremental work, no dramatic breakthroughs. From the inside, it was something else entirely. It was the slow shaping of a key for a lock that had held for 227 years. And the night the drill reached 120 feet, the key finally turned. What 120 feet revealed changed everything. For the first time in the island's history, an instrument had gone deep enough to tell a story the subsurface had never been able to share before. Above 100 feet, the geology was familiar. Bedrock consistent with Nova Scotia's coastal formations. Signs of past human disturbance at shallower levels. Evidence of earlier excavation attempts. Clear indicators of where the engineered flood tunnels ran and how they connected to the ocean. All of that fit the existing understanding. But below 100 feet, the picture shifted. Between 100 and 110 feet, the core showed a transition zone. The material there didn't match the natural bedrock above it, or the material below. The on-site geologist described it as deliberate backfill, not naturally formed, placed. It was a mix of geological types that don't normally occur together in that formation. The kind of material you use when you want to conceal or protect what lies underneath. Deliberate backfill at 110 feet, the kind you install when you don't want something discovered. Then, at 115 feet, the drill encountered resistance that wasn't typical bedrock. The drill had already been cutting through rock. This felt different, denser, more regular, more structured. The drill rate slowed. Torque readings spiked. The engineer monitoring the instruments said quietly, without even looking up, "We're in something." The core from 115 to 118 feet contained compressed organic material. The geologist needed several minutes to evaluate it. It was wood, but not wood in a natural state of decay. It was preserved in a way consistent with sealed anaerobic conditions, meaning it had been protected from oxygen. That kind of preservation doesn't happen by accident at that depth. It wasn't random debris. It was structural, arranged. Structural timber at 115 feet. Below the flood tunnel network, beneath the backfill layer, sealed from the surface since the day it was placed there. And then came the 118 to 120 foot sample. The geologist turned it over 3 times before speaking. It was dense, regular. Its specific gravity didn't match the surrounding geology. Its compression characteristics were unlike any natural formation found in the layers above. More telling still were the chemical readings. Using portable analysis equipment on site, the team identified oxidation patterns and chemical signatures consistent with long-term contact between organic material and a metallic object in sealed conditions. Not metal itself, but the chemical imprint metal leaves behind after sitting in an oxygen-deprived environment for centuries. The signature created when organic materials, like textiles or wood, decompose slowly around a metallic object. The kind of signature that only forms over long periods of time. That's when the geologist said the 6 words. This did not form here naturally. Rick Lagina has never been someone who rushes to declare victory. His approach to Oak Island has always been deliberate and measured. At times, that restraint frustrated people who wanted dramatic conclusions. But it was that same restraint that made this moment matter. When Rick says something is significant, it carries the weight of 23 years of careful, disciplined investigation. Standing in the pre-dawn dark, holding the 120-foot core sample, he didn't announce treasure. He didn't claim confirmation of fortune. He said something far more precise. This is structural construction below the flood zone. It's not natural formation, and the chemical signatures are consistent with what you'd expect surrounding a metallic deposit that's been sealed for a long period. That is not a treasure announcement. That is evidence. There's a difference. Rick had evidence. What exactly sat at 120 feet, its full composition, its historical origin, its value, would require further investigation. But the existence of something built, something placed, was no longer theoretical. And that alone changed the entire debate. For 227 years, the central question had been simple. Was there ever really anything down there? Or had generations misinterpreted a complex natural geological system as human engineering? Had the money, the effort, the cultural fascination, even the lives lost, been built on misunderstanding? The 120-foot core sample answered that. Human construction exists below the flood zone at Oak Island. The engineered backfill, the structural timber, the chemical evidence of long-term metallic presence. Something was built at 120 feet, and something was placed within what was built. It had remained there long enough for centuries of chemical interaction to mark the surrounding material, long enough to leave behind a measurable signature of sealed anaerobic preservation. The skeptical argument wasn't just weakened, it was physically closed by a core sample sitting on a table before sunrise. The $290 million question. The figure, $290 million, needs to be handled carefully. In the same measured way, Rick Lagina approaches everything on Oak Island. It is not a confirmed recovery amount. It is not a promotional headline. It is an evidence-based estimate derived from what the physical findings at 120 feet suggest about the scale and nature of what lies sealed below. After the drilling operation, core samples from 120 feet were sent for independent laboratory analysis. Over the following weeks, geochemical testing produced composition profiles consistent with certain categories of historical metallic deposits. Scientists examined the density and distribution of chemical markers embedded in the surrounding geological material. Those markers were then used to model the approximate volume and concentration of metallic material present in the sealed chamber beneath 118 feet. When that modeled volume was applied to current precious metal values, the estimate range placed $290 million at the conservative midpoint. Conservative midpoint. Not a ceiling, not a hype number. The methodology behind that estimate was submitted to independent geochemists who specialize in analyzing historical deposit signatures from drill core material. Their review confirmed 2 key things. The chemical evidence was genuine. The volume modeling was methodologically sound within the known limits of indirect assessment. Their conclusion was clear. The core material contains geochemical signatures consistent with a substantial metallic deposit in the sealed space below 118 feet. They also acknowledged the inherent limitations of indirect modeling, but emphasized that the evidence for significant metallic content was robust. Robust evidence of significant metallic content at 120 feet beneath Oak Island. The $290 million figure is what robust evidence looks like when translated through geochemical modeling into present-day precious metal values. It is grounded in physical data and independent scientific review, but it is not the final number. The final number comes from full recovery, and full recovery only follows proof. That sequence, evidence first, conclusion second, is how Rick Lagina has always approached Oak Island. And he applied that same discipline to the most significant discovery in the investigation's history. What changes now? The morning after the breakthrough, Rick gathered the team. He didn't begin with, "How do we get to it?" That question already had operational pathways in development. Instead, he asked something different. What does the existence of construction at 120 feet tell us about everything we thought we understood? That question reframed everything. It's typical of Rick: step back before stepping forward. Let major evidence reshape the conceptual framework instead of just attaching it to old assumptions. The discovery of structural construction below the flood tunnel network challenged several long-held beliefs within the Oak Island research community. It changed the depth model. Most previous theories placed the primary vault at or above flood tunnel depth. The assumption was that the flood system was built at the level of the deposit to protect it from above. But finding significant construction at 120 feet below the flood tunnels suggests something different. Either the flood defense was protecting access to a deeper, sub-flood installation, or the 120-foot structure is one component of a multi-level system. Both interpretations have major implications for recovery strategy and sequencing. The operational approach depends entirely on which model proves accurate. It changed the engineering assessment. The preserved structural timber at 120 feet demonstrated remarkable sophistication. Wood surviving in sealed, anaerobic conditions for over 2 centuries doesn't happen by accident. That means the builders didn't simply dig a hole and refill it. They engineered a preservation environment. They created a sealed system designed to maintain the integrity of what was inside, potentially indefinitely. You engineer indefinite preservation when you don't know when retrieval will happen. The builders at 120 feet were not planning to return in a few years. They were planning for the possibility that it might be a very long time before anyone came back. That changes the profile of who they were. It changes their circumstances. It changes their intent. It changes what they considered valuable enough to protect across centuries. More than metal? The $290 million estimate is based solely on metallic content. But preservation engineering designed for an indefinite timeline raises bigger questions. What kind of deposit requires that level of long-term protection? It could include materials whose value exceeds precious metal weight, historical documents, legal instruments, records, cultural or political artifacts, items whose importance isn't measured in gold prices. The geochemical assessment confirms metallic presence. It cannot fully answer what else may be inside. The 120-foot discovery opened that question. 23 years and 1 morning. The season Rick pushed to 120 feet, he turned 65. That detail carries weight, especially for those who followed Oak Island for years. 23 years, more than a third of his life. From the moment he read that Reader's Digest article as a boy, to the pre-dawn morning when a core sample confirmed that the mystery was real, human-made, engineered, intentional. Over the years, many people have asked Rick if he ever doubted. If there were stretches when the rational assessment of time versus results suggested he should walk away. When the math might have told a different person, it was time to stop. His answer has remained consistent for 23 years. And it only makes sense if you understand what he was truly committed to. He wasn't committed to a payout. He was committed to the question. And at 120 feet, that question finally changed. "I'm not committed to finding treasure," Rick has said many times over the years in different ways. "I'm committed to understanding what's on this island. If that understanding leads to treasure, that's one outcome. If it leads to a real conclusion that there's nothing there, not an assumption, but a proven conclusion, that's also an outcome. What I can't do is stop before the understanding is complete." For Rick, that understanding became complete at 4:47 on a late summer morning, when a core sample pulled from 120 feet confirmed what 23 years of preparation had positioned him to finally hear. There is something there. At 120 feet beneath Oak Island is structural construction built by people who understood engineering and who understood time. It sits below a sophisticated flood defense system that took 2 decades for the modern investigation to map and comprehend. It has been preserved in a sealed anaerobic environment for 227 years by builders who designed it to endure for the long term. The understanding is complete. Recovery comes next. Conclusion. At 4:47 in the morning, Rick Lagina pushed a drill string 120 feet beneath Oak Island and brought up a core sample that closed the oldest open question in treasure hunting history. Not the treasure itself, the proof. Structural construction below the flood zone, preserved timber in sealed anaerobic conditions, geochemical signatures of a metallic deposit that independent scientific assessment valued at a conservative midpoint of $290 million. For 227 years, people argued about whether anything was actually down there. 6 lives were lost. Millions of dollars were spent. Generations cycled through hope, doubt, belief, and disappointment. The answer didn't come as a dramatic announcement. It wasn't a theory. It wasn't speculation. It came up in a cylinder of earth. Physical evidence pulled from a depth every previous effort had failed to reach. Rick didn't get there through a reckless gamble. Not through a flashy theory defended against critics. Not through a single brilliant insight that everyone else missed. He got there through 23 years of exactly the kind of work the island demanded. Methodical, patient, careful, resistant to premature conclusions, willing to spend years building capability before using it. The drilling protocol that allowed penetration to 120 feet without triggering the flood system took 3 seasons to develop. The geological understanding that pointed to 120 feet as the critical depth took 2 decades to accumulate. The credibility required to assemble the technical team and secure the support necessary for such an operation took every year of the investigation to build. 23 years of preparation for 1 core sample. 23 years that led to 6 words spoken before sunrise. This did not form here naturally, and it didn't. It was built by people whose engineering skill had challenged searchers for over 2 centuries. Rick Lagina finally matched that engineering. 120 feet down, in the dark, he held proof of a secret the island had guarded since before any living person's great-great-grandparents were born. But the discovery at 120 feet isn't the end of the Oak Island story. It's the moment the story finally understands what it's actually about. For 227 years, the search built toward that depth. The depth was the answer. Rick Lagina found it. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the mystery, please subscribe to the Timefold channel and don't forget to like.